came out from Public Health England, which a lot of people in the BAME community thought was utterly useless. Because although it reaffirmed the fact that people in that community are disproportionately at risk, there were no measures suggested for how to mitigate those risks. How soon will your inquiry get up and running, and what recommendations will be given in what sort of time frame?
Well, the inquiry launches today. Is very important from my perspective and that of the whole committee. And we discussed this last week when the PHE review was published. We absolutely are insistent that our report has recommendations, that it comes out at pace, because the reality is that Black, Asian, minority ethnic people are more likely to die of COVID. That's as serious as it gets. And I was disappointed that there were no recommendations in the PHE review. I think it's critically important that the government has some actions, so it shows how it is protecting our BAME community, how it's mitigating against the risks. And I think it's crucial that we do this as fast as we can. Important to reflect that this is a select committee. We don't have the same resources as government departments. We're not in a position to make decisions and implement them instantly, but it's very important to us that we get people like the Health Secretary in so he can tell us what he's actually doing.
For instance, we know that, BAME community workers represented in large numbers, for instance, in health and care frontline jobs, public transport frontline jobs. I mean, you can probably move quite quickly on that, can't you, and implement proper risk assessments or other mitigating factors for people who are working in those jobs?
Well, I think you can. And we've already seen examples. There's a health trust in Somerset that implemented measures to safeguard BAME workers in their trust. Now, that's quite easy in Somerset because it's not a particularly diverse part of the country, much, much harder in London. But I think it's crucial that the government is listening to voices like Donna Kinnair, who's the chief exec of the Royal College of Nursing, and listening to people like her and saying, well, what can we do now, even just as interim measures, to make sure that we're keeping BAME people safe when they are, as you said, absolutely on the front line, whether it's in transport, in health and social care, whether it's in our hospitals as porters and cleaners. We have to make sure that they're kept as safe as possible.
Caroline knows Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said a few days ago that he takes full responsibility for the government's handling of the pandemic and said, I'm very proud of our record. Now, I did a quick fact check on the record just last night. PPE failed spectacularly. Testing failed. Actually stopped it at one stage, then brought it back. Protecting care homes failed. Over 20,000 excess deaths now in care homes. The lockdown, by common consent, was way too late. Herd immunity, massive U-turn, was started and then stopped. Face masks, we were told, were not needed. Massive U-turn, now they're needed. Quarantine wasn't needed while 20 million people came into the country. Now we're doing quarantine for reasons that no one can understand. And you put all this together, we currently have the worst reported death rate in the entire world for coronavirus. Over 66,000 excess deaths now are believed to be coronavirus related in this country. And the government's handling, according to YouGov, is now equal worst in the world in terms of what the public perception of that handling to be. I just wonder whether, as a Conservative MP, given all that, you could tell me what exactly it is that Boris Johnson is proud of.
Well, I think we did fantastically well to get the Nightingale hospitals up and ready in case the NHS was overwhelmed. It wasn't overwhelmed. I think our NHS has done a phenomenal job, and we know that in hospitals around the country, the numbers of COVID cases are now quite small. I think there have been challenges, and 2020 hindsight is always a marvellous thing, but it's crucially important that we learn the lessons, that we act as quickly as we can in those areas where we haven't done well. And I think there are still some outstanding...
Would you dispute any of the things that I just said?
Well, look, I think the facts are there, aren't they, Piers? And you have to be completely candid about that. Too many people have died. Too many people have been infected. And I have said from the outset, I think we were slow into lockdown, and quarantine is coming at the wrong time. And had we quarantined much sooner, perhaps followed the models of countries like Australia and New Zealand, who closed borders, we would have seen fewer infections.
But that's where it's interesting. Is you talk about 2020 hindsight, and I know to your credit, you've been quite outspokenly critical of government in many areas. I'm not targeting you here for the blame. You're not in the government now. But when I look at this, 2020 hindsight, it was there at the time. It was there at the time that other countries were locking down earlier, that other countries were banning mass gatherings as we carried on with Cheltenham Festival and so on. It was there at the time that other countries were preparing for a coronavirus-style pandemic whilst we didn't. Testing, other countries were just up and running with testing so much earlier because they had planned for that. Face masks all round Asia. They used them from the very start and have had much better records than we have. The quarantine, as you allude to. On all these things, I don't think it's 2020 hindsight. I can remember on this show at the start of March shouting for this stuff. We both were. I can remember in February other countries doing this stuff. What I can't understand is why our government wasn't looking at what was happening elsewhere and wondering why we were doing something completely different.
Well, I think back in March, I was shouting too, Piers, because I had an urgent question in the House at a time when our advice was still only have essential travel. The rest of the world was shutting borders, closing transit routes so that British citizens couldn't get back here. And I was shouting at the Foreign Secretary at the time saying, come on, you've got to upgrade the advice to come home now, and you've got to help people come home. So I think a lot of us have been shouting on different aspects of this pandemic. At the moment, as chair of Women Equality Select Committee, I'm particularly focusing on what we're doing to help BAME people, what we're doing about the gendered impact of COVID and the fact that mothers can't get their kids back to school, so they can't get back to work, and the financial impact that's going to have on them and on their career prospects. And all of this.
Not just mothers, of course. Not just mothers.
Sorry? Not just mothers, Piers, but when you look at the Institute for Fiscal Studies report last week, or the week before last, that was talking about the gendered impact and how the burden of childcare has disproportionately fallen.
No, I get that, but I think it would be wrong of you in your position. I'm sure you'd agree. I know, but it'd be wrong of you just to categorise the issue is purely for mothers, right?
No, but I think the point is that her committee is investigating whether there is a disproportionate impact on women in this crisis.
I understand, but you used the phrase mothers having an issue about, schools and so on. Actually, a lot of men are also involved in that decision-making and are impacted by the failure of their kids to go to school. So we should be fair about that.
Yeah, we should be fair about it, Piers, but it is right to say that it is mothers' careers that have taken the biggest hit. They are more likely to be furloughed than their male colleagues. They are more likely to be working in sectors of the economy that are still shut down and are opening up latest. So there is a gendered impact. That's why we're doing the inquiry to find out how. But it's why I'm also calling for measures like support for the childcare sector so that we can make sure that parents can get back to work without having to make those trade-offs between couples as to whose career suffers. So
you're the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee. I wonder how concerned you are about schooling right now and what kind of questions you've been shouting at the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson. Because I think a lot of people, and not just parents, are really concerned about the fact that there are some children who are going to miss out on potentially 6 months or more of formal education. And what that might mean, we've already been talking about the chasm that could open up between those who are privately educated and those who are educated in the state sector. But there is also going to be a chasm within the state sector itself between those who have the advantage, perhaps, of having parents who can homeschool and do have access to laptops, and those who don't. I mean, for instance, where are the laptops that Gavin Williamson promised head teachers? There are still teachers who are complaining they haven't been able to get their hands on them.
OK, firstly, yesterday there was a statement in the House from Gavin Williamson. The new arrangement so that we have social distancing in the chamber mean that you submit your name into a ballot to get called out. And I didn't get called out in yesterday's ballot, so I wasn't able to ask the Secretary of State a question. Hugely disappointing. And that's one of the challenges we face over parliamentary scrutiny at the moment, and why it's important that MPs are here and working and trying to hold the government to account, but there are still massive challenges around that. So I wasn't able to ask a question yesterday. I think from the perspective of schools I've spoken to head teachers in my constituency who are desperate to be able to open up because they recognise absolutely what you've said, Susanna, that some children have access to better equipment than others, that the most disadvantaged children benefit the most from education. They need to be in school, and particularly for those at crucial stages of their education. So those who are in Year 10 have now missed an entire term.
And we know all that. I mean, Caroline Noakes, you're stating facts that we know. I mean, Alison Pearson today in the Daily Telegraph, under a campaign called Save Our Schools, calls it a national scandal. There is a risk that we're going to lose a generation of school children's education. I mean, there are some kids who are not going to be able to catch up. It is a national scandal. Where has the Education Secretary been? And where is the alternative if he cannot get the schools up and running again?
Well, he was in the House yesterday, and he has been...
So he's made an appearance in the House, but that doesn't... It hasn't fixed anything, has it? He actually told us that he doesn't think that schools, you know, primary schools aren't going to be fully open before the end of the term, and secondary schools are unlikely to even be able to open in September in some cases.